Hi, my name is Randy Agert, and this is for the class Bad Words and Taboo Terms. In this video, we're going to be talking about speech acts, which are a part of pragmatics. And pragmatics is always about communicated meaning. The idea behind speech acts is that whenever we use language to communicate, we're always performing an act, a speech act, which has social consequences. According to John Austin, we can break speech acts into three component parts: the locution, the illocution, and the perlocution. The locution has to do with the form of the utterance. So that would include the grammar. So for example, the syntax, the words that form together to form a sentence. Or the morphology, how these smaller meaningful parts build up larger words. Or the phonology, how segments of sounds build up together to form words. And the semantics, the linguistic meaning. Would also include the locution, would also include how loud it's said, or how soft it's said, or the prosody that's used. That has to do with the rhythm of the sentence and the melody of the sentence. The illocution, on the other hand, gets at the intentions of the speaker. It's the intended purpose of the utterance. Or another way of looking at it is what is produced in saying the locution. So for example, it could be a promise. It could be a threat, an insult, a compliment, an apology, right? So all those different ways that we have of describing speech acts are ways of describing illocutions. Finally, the perlocution is the effect that the speech act has on the recipient. It's what is produced by saying the locution. Another way of getting at the difference between the illocution and the perlocution is by asking two separate questions. So for the illocution, we would ask, in uttering the locution, what was the speaker doing? So you could say the speaker was threatening, the speaker was promising, the speaker was complimenting. Or we could ask the question, after hearing the locution, what did the hearer do? The hearer was flattered, the hearer was threatened, the hearer was upset, the hearer slapped the speaker across the face. So now what I want to do is look at some more specific examples. But in every case, we're going to be looking at the same essential locution. But in each case, we're going to get a different illocution and different perlocution. So imagine that this angry woman, who for some reason is holding books on top of her head, shouts, "You're such a bitch." So what is she doing in performing that speech act? What is the illocution? And how does the recipient respond to it? Or imagine this woman here who's got this kind of mischievous smile on her face, and she says, "You're such a bitch." Now in this case, what is she doing? And how is the recipient going to respond now? Or imagine this woman who looks a little bit sad, a little bit vulnerable, says, "You're such a bitch." And again, the question is, what is she doing in saying that? How is the recipient going to respond to it? And we could imagine that there's a lot of background here. There's a lot of context that you're going to need to know what was intended. So when the angry woman says it, or when the mischievous woman or the vulnerable woman says it, in each case, we have to build a backstory. We have to imagine why they're saying it in order to get at the illocution. And we have to imagine who they're saying it to in order to understand how they're going to respond. And I want you to imagine in each case the difference that would happen if it were a woman they were saying it to versus a man. So if that angry woman says it to a man, it's clearly going to be a very different illocution than if she says it to a woman. And now we can imagine different speakers. So this time, this man who seems to be particularly upset or sad about something, and he says, "You're such a bitch." Well, now it's going to be a different sort of elocution. And I think that all of us can understand that it's going to be different when a man says, "You're such a bitch," than when a woman says, "You're such a bitch." Or if this guy, who looks a little annoyed, says, "You're such a bitch." Or if this guy over here, who's got this kind of creepy smile on his face, says, "You're such a bitch." And again, there's going to be differences if each of these men is saying it to a woman versus if they're saying it to a man. Another thing we need to talk about when we talk about speech acts is tabooness versus offensiveness. Tabooness belongs to the social meaning of a word, the linguistic meaning. Therefore, tabooness is part of the locution. Offensiveness is how an utterance is perceived, i.e. as polite or offensive. Therefore, offensiveness is part of the perlocution. It's an important distinction to make, this difference between tabooness and offensiveness. Clearly, they're related, but we have to realize that they're separate. One of them has to do with the linguistic meaning, the other has to do with the communicated meaning. One of them has to do with the locution, one has to do with the perlocution. We also have to understand that intentions are important. We can't ignore any of the three aspects of a speech act, especially when talking about swearing. We have to understand that the intentions play a big role in it. So the intentions of the speaker are important. But we also have to understand that the reaction of the hearer is also important, and the larger speech community is important. So we have to understand that words have resonance outside of a particular context out to the larger context of the community. So again, the three aspects of a speech act are the locution, the linguistic properties of the utterance, the elocution, the manifest intentions of the speaker in making the utterance, and the perlocution, the effect of the utterance on the recipients. Each one of those is equally important when we're looking at what gets communicated. We have to understand that the linguistic meaning is important. We also have to understand that the intentions of the speaker are important, but we also have to understand that the recipient is contributing to the communicated meaning as well.